Hi, welcome to Talking Brains, a podcast about mental health, books, and what makes brains happy. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Sarkis. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second season, 9th episode of Talking Brains. And today we're going to be talking with Buster Benson. Buster is the author of the new book, Why Are We Yelling? The Art of Productive Disagreement. If you read my Forbes blog, you'll see that I have mentioned this book in a few posts. I think this book is a really excellent way to get some real conversations going where we really listen to each other and take into account others' points of view. So Buster is an entrepreneur and former product leader at Amazon, Twitter, Slack, and Patreon. He's now the CEO of 750words.com and writes for Medium and busterbenson.com. And this is his first book. Okay, so welcome to the podcast, Buster.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Is it okay to call you Buster? Is that fine?
That is my name, yes.
Okay. Oh, good. So what we're talking about today is your new book, which is Why Are We Yelling? The Art of Productive Disagreement. Mm-hmm. And I have to say it's a really valuable book for people. Anyone that's, I would say anybody that exists, probably, not just people in the business world, because you talk about some really interesting facets of disagreements. And I think what I usually tell people, for instance, in couples therapy, is that fighting's not okay, but disagreements are normal, and that it's actually more of an issue if you don't have disagreements.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so it sounds, and from reading the book, it sounds like you come from that perspective too.
Yeah.
So tell me first just a little bit about what inspired you to write the book.
Yeah, it's been a long journey, I suppose. I was a product manager by trade and an engineer, so I worked in the tech world for quite a while, 20 years or so. And, you know, it turns out that most of the work that I ended up doing was around facilitating conversations and keeping groups together and inspiring people and, you know, helping resolve disagreements and just all these things that are, you know, you don't learn them in school. You can't really find books about them. You just have, that's sort of an art of conversation and relationship. And it wasn't until, you know, I guess a big turning point was, you know, the 2013 election when I realized that I had these friends who I'd been talking to for a long time. We always prided ourselves on being great at sort of civil disagreement. And yet it was completely unsatisfying at the end of the day. And we ended up avoiding the topics more than actually having the conversations because we were trying to be polite and nice. Mm-hmm. And I realized I was missing something. I was missing some kind of core understanding about how to have productive disagreements. And, you know, that's what sparked this. I was like, what am I missing that is out there? It's got to be out there. People are writing about this, but I don't understand it. It hasn't been written for me. And so I decided to write a book for myself and for other people that aren't necessarily academics or therapists or people that are like professionals at this to sort of solve the everyday conversation problem that we have.
And if you could explain a little bit about the weeds that were in your yard. I think that's an opening story that you have. If you could explain a little bit about that, because I thought that was a really beautiful analogy. So if you just want to take off on that. And
it starts with this story about a guy who, you know, is like super frustrated with all the weeds in his yard. And this person is basically me. So, you know, I moved into Berkeley and, you know, we have this weed called oxalis or sour grass that's just everywhere. And the first year we just pulled it out like mad. We felt like so victorious, like it's all gone, great. You know, and then inevitably like 6 months later, it starts to grow back again and not even more so. And it just became this plight of like, wait, I think I'm doing the right thing by pulling them out, but obviously I'm not. So I think of weeds as the weeds are like disagreements in a relationship. The house is, you know, the garden that you have is the relationship, everything you intentionally plant in the relationship, the things you do on purpose, the vacations, the conversations, the plans. And then the weeds are the things that grow up around that and sort of cause trouble that you don't want to be there, but they're actually a big part of the ecosystem as well. A good garden needs to have, you know, nutrients in the soil, and weeds help bring that up. And if you try to get rid of all the weeds, you might end up killing your garden as well. So these kinds of things where like it's not necessarily about getting rid of them. It's about learning to live with them, learning how to have a garden with weeds in it, and also to be a gardener that can, you know, have some level of peace in their life despite the fact that everything isn't perfect all the time.
I think that's a really great analogy that weeds, you have to have them in order to have productive relationships or productive garden.
Right.
And so that gets me a little bit into the three myths you have about disagreements. One being that arguments are bad. So tell me a little bit about that myth, because I thought you had a really good point that it's a signpost, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. So if you could explain a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of arguments as signposts because I use a lot of metaphors, as you can see. But I don't think if you ask someone like, are all disagreements bad? They won't necessarily say yes to that. But if you look at how we act and how we have our conversations, you can see that we're always trying to remove them, right? We're always trying to squash the disagreements and trying to just like resolve them so that they're gone. But they're important because a disagreement is about, I define it early in the book as like two perspectives that have some kind of unacceptable difference, right? So there's somebody that sees something one way and somebody that sees something another way, and they don't quite mesh together, and it creates this dissonance. And that dissonance is really the perimeter of your own mind and the rest of the world, right? So there's something in your head that's wrong, or something in their head that's wrong, and it needs to be resolved. I see it as a signpost. It's pointing to something not only that is potentially going to lead to learning about something that you don't know, but also because it actually feels bad, oftentimes, it's also pointing inward at a personal value or something that you find important. Because if it's just a difference about something that's unimportant, it's not going to make you upset. But if it does make you upset, there's probably something deep down that's like, okay, my belief about this is being threatened a little bit, and I can actually learn about myself as well as use that knowledge to ask the person, like, do you mean to threaten this value that I have? Is that actually what you're trying to say? So it leads to this miscommunication.
And I think there's a really good point that there are no bad people. It's just that different perceptions of issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard position to own, I guess, but I think we oftentimes misinterpret people as wanting to threaten us more than they really are, and oftentimes they're protecting themselves in some way that they feel threatened by as well.
Right,
I think we perceive that.
Yeah, and I think it makes it a little bit easier for us if we say, oh, well, this person's bad, so therefore we don't have to work as hard to look at our own stuff.
Yes.
Maybe?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
It's a nice defense mechanism, but doesn't always work well. So, right. And then misconception 2, arguments change minds. So tell me about that myth.
It's a strong belief we have, is that we go into these arguments and disagreements thinking like my goal, my duty even, is to squash that person's false belief about something, right? And so we operate in a way that we think that that's going to happen immediately, as well as that it's going to happen at all. So I sort of talk about this in the context of, think about a mind, right? We are many, many layers of beliefs and stories and facts. And we can't just rewire our entire brain to point in a completely different direction in one sitting, like a 5-minute conversation. Minds change slowly; they aren't often changed intentionally, and so the context that a mind changes is a I would say a two-way street, right? Like if you want to change someone's mind, you have to be willing to change your mind with them, and that means having a relationship. That means building some trust. That means being willing to let go of where you are so you can walk together down some path. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't collapse a disagreement into like A or B. It's oftentimes like, let's go look at C and D and E as well. Mm-hmm. And we're now going to understand this whole set of possibilities in a different light that allows A and B to exist together. And maybe B wasn't what you thought it was in the first place as well. So I think we just have a very strict and rigid definition for what changing a mind means, when even just like a bigger perspective is a mind changing. Even sort of having the ability to see how something could happen, even if it's not what you prefer, that's another way to change your mind. So we should just expand that possibility space of like things that can happen.
So focused on solutions rather than focused on problems.
Or focus on learning, right? I think what is it? One of the things that I I pick up on a lot now is when people say something like, I don't understand how you could believe this. You must be an idiot, basically. Um, Whereas you could say, I don't understand how you can believe this. Can you help me understand how you believe this? Then I don't have to, that spark of anger won't happen as easily. We won't feel like we're surrounded by idiots all the time.
So Buster says, don't call someone an idiot. Let me write that down.
Yeah.
That doesn't help with disagreements. Don't call someone an idiot. It doesn't change minds. And then later on, I want to talk about, too, the dinner you had with the gun control opinions. So that was really interesting. But misconception 3, arguments end, which gets into the weed analogy.
Yeah. I think this is my favorite one because it sort of forces one of the biggest shifts I think we can do in terms of mindset is to shift from a problem solution mindset to a sort of a systems mindset where you're like, okay, well, I don't try to approach cleaning my room with a problem solution mindset. I go into it with how am I going to live within this room so that it can be dirty sometimes and clean sometimes, and I can sort of live with it. And I think that's the right way to think about arguments, because if you ask people, in any relationship, in any friendship, in any parent-child relationship, are there arguments that you've had for a long time? And they'll always say yes. Like there's always, at least one, sometimes a dozen arguments that are just go-to, almost like games, right? Where the relationship is about, okay, now we're going to argue about this. Now we're going to argue about this. And it stops being really, oftentimes even feeling bad. It becomes part of the dance of the relationship. It's just like banter and have these conversations. But nonetheless, that's a good, healthy equilibrium. If each time you start talking about, I like this show, you like that show, why can't we get along? That's going to wear away at the relationship over time and cause resentment and cynicism eventually, just separation. So I think embracing the fact that, especially arguments that are based on personal values or preferences or beliefs, they're going to be around. The actual conversation might end, but the belief is still there, and it's going to happen again. So we have to learn how to almost appreciate that and even enjoy it. And that's sort of, if every conversation and disagreement can lead to a closer relationship, then it's sustainable.
Right, and I think that's a really important concept, that disagreements can actually strengthen your bond.
Yeah, because you're it's a dance, right? You don't want to, if you just turned everyone into your clone, you would never have any, there would be nothing enjoyable about life. Mm-hmm. So this difference, this diverse sort of perspective is a source of joy in some cases.
So, and it sounds like also sometimes it's not so much the content, it's the process, how you go about discussing it rather than the actual topic.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about we don't know how to argue, and the content is oftentimes, how many times have you been coming out of an argument and you're like, what even started that? Like, it wasn't about the content. It was about, you. At the end of the day, you're just mad at them for being mean to you. And that was a result of the process, not the content. And so I think if the process can result in enjoyment and connection, then you'll come up and be like, wow, that was great.
and I really like that you use real life examples too.
I have plenty of them, yeah.
That you discussed, with your family, and I think that really connects with people. That you're not just writing a book; you've actually experimented and used some of these techniques yourself. And I think that's really, really kind of fascinating. So also, you talk about the 3 realms of disagreement: the head, the heart, and the hand. So if you could explain what each of those are. Absolutely.
So if you think about a disagreement as an unacceptable difference between 2 perspectives, you can think about, well, how do you resolve that? What do you do with that difference? Like, how do you validate that something is right or wrong? If you think that the moon is 5 miles away and I think it's 1,000,000 miles away, in that case we can go somewhere that we both trust and say, okay, let's look it up in the the encyclopedia or in a science book, and we can actually resolve that. I consider those kinds of arguments of the head, of like information. There's something, there's some truth to be found in a source that we trust, that we can go out and look it up. We might not have it with us, but we can go find it. And we think that all arguments are that one. We always think that there's some kind of evidence I could provide you that will convince you because it's irrefutably true. But turns out that I think that's a very small percentage of the disagreements. We try to turn disagreements into that, but oftentimes that's not what they're really about. The second one, the heart, is about conflicts of sort of meaning and importance. So like I might say like I love this show, and you say like I hate this show. We can argue about whether or not it's a good show or not. We can't look this up anywhere. We can't like find some source out there that's going to say like, okay, this show is good, this show is bad. You could probably find reviews and other people that agree with you or disagree with you, but you can't. It's not the conclusive truth on the matter. Ultimately, it's about how much I enjoy it, how much you enjoy it, and so many things are in this realm of importance and meaning that we don't acknowledge. And the way to resolve these kinds of arguments is by sharing stories, by sharing like how did these beliefs form, why did these become important to me, and if I can see why you don't like the show because of your personal preferences, then I will no longer be baffled by the fact that you don't like it, right? And the same vice versa. And so you would go about a very different set of skills and steps to resolve a disagreement like that. You should ask things like, where did that belief come from? Like, how has this helped you in the past? How does this help you like sort of see the world differently? And these kinds of stories lead to really rich conversations, and they're really enjoyable as well. And the last one is the hands, which is the hardest to explain, but basically I think of the hands as strategy. So you think that if we take this route to the store, it's going to get us there faster than if we take that route. There's no way to really, I guess in that case you could look up on a map. There's a lot of things where you vote for candidate A, I vote for candidate B. Which one's going to lead to a better country? We can't resolve that with information. It's also not entirely about just the heart, because ultimately it's about something happening in the world. And we want something to happen, and we think that this is the best path towards that thing happening. And so I call it out specifically because I often think that the most rewarding disagreements are actually in this realm, because it involves not only you and me, but also some kind of interaction with the world, some kind of sort of relationship over time that can sort of turn out to be different results, and you can learn about the world, you can learn about each other, and it's a more participatory kind of disagreement. And the hard part about this one is also that it can collapse into the heart or the hand, or the heart or the head ones, because you could say like this is more important, therefore we should do this, or you could say like this is more important because the polls said this, and it's easy to get wrapped up in those. But when you are there and doing that, it's just going to be frustrating, because it's ultimately not about the information or even the importance. It's about what's going to happen in the future.
And it sounds like there's a good deal of letting go of ego,
mm-hmm.
and connecting with the other person rather than letting go of the I, me stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely all of them can be done in productive or unproductive ways, I think. But I think of a great conversation or a great disagreement as a dance of sorts. Like you have to move in your spot. You have to move to different spots to let them move into your spot and sort of see your perspective and you see their perspective. And you have to be able to do this in a way that is both light-footed and and skilled. It takes time. It's hard to lead and follow, in a dance, and you sort of have to get a sense for like what the other person wants to do, and ultimately you can't just say like, yes, this dance is all about getting to that side of the room, because that's just not enjoyable, and that might not be where you should be at the end of the day.
Right. So you have to have a degree of empathy, but it also sounds like if you're not really sure about what empathy is or how you practice it, that in your book you get into that too, how you feel, how you step into someone else's shoes and vice versa.
Right. Yeah, it is hard. It's definitely, we aren't taught this either. So
no,
I think
we aren't. We really aren't. And that probably should be part of curriculum somewhere, that we talk about, not only critical thinking skills, but how to interact with people.
Yeah. And I wonder why it hasn't been taught. I think part of it is that, as teachers, we always have our perspective. Mm-hmm. And we always are best at teaching from our perspective
Hmm.
versus letting other people's perspectives into the room. It becomes less predictable what's going to happen when you just let other people drive the conversation. But um, yeah, it must
Right.
happen.
And we're about the same age by a couple of years. So I remember that we did values clarification in middle school, and we
Hmm.
had a teacher that got into talking about empathy and how you relate to other people. And I'm assuming somebody complained at school because he stopped doing that after a while. And I think you're right. I think it gets into too much, almost too much open mindedness. And
Right.
sometimes that scares people a little bit, I think.
Yeah, and it's unpredictable. You don't know what's going to
Yeah.
happen. Yeah.
Right, right, yeah. It's more helpful, especially when you're working with middle schoolers, probably to have a little more under under control, probably.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Most of
so,
our institutions are about scaling teaching and sort of
hmm,
predictability, and
right,
these are not tools that enhance that.
right, right. So, yeah, he was probably ahead of his time, back in the '80s. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, and I guess that actually, and I was actually thinking about his class when I was reading your book and then writing articles about it on Forbes and talking now about how values are just values. It doesn't mean one's right or wrong. It just means that, like you said, it's perspectives, and that's not a threat to you. It's again an avenue for learning more about yourself.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, and I think that's so valuable, and I can't repeat that enough to people. And tell me a little bit about your dinner party you had with people with different opinions on gun control, because I find this fascinating. Because when I do collaborative divorce, so we have, and the goal is if you're going to get divorced, let's do it in a way that everybody kind of can co-parent effectively. So we have each of the parties, each of the spouses with their attorneys and a financial person. Then I kind of mediate or facilitate the discussion, and I always bring food. Always, always, always. And I bring junk food, so I bring cookies and chocolate, and I bring some healthy stuff because we like having comfort food, and food is this great equalizer. So tell me a little bit about the. I was really fascinated to find out the role of food in getting people to communicate with each other. So if you could talk a little bit more
Yeah,
about that dinner party you had.
yeah. There was a version of the book that was all about food and potlucks,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like this is
Mm-hmm.
just the one tool you need.
Yep.
I do feel like it is so easy to do and familiar, and it works,
Mm-hmm.
that it's worth really considering. But the idea was, invite people to dinner as like a potluck or a salon around a controversial topic. So this was gun control, and we wanted to have as many diverse people around the table. So I think about 12, 15 people came. There was one like former member of the NRA. There's several people that own guns. Some people that had just bought guns. A lot of people had used guns before. Some people had never used it before. Some people have been the victim of like gun violence, or have been near it in their families. Sometimes it's been around suicide. So there's a whole diverse range of people. And first off, like going on and sharing our stories about our relationships to guns was so eye-opening. These are people that, like, many of them I've known for years. I didn't know this stuff about them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that alone was really rewarding. After we went around and shared stories, I shared some just like general statistics about gun violence, and we decided to break up into small groups. And actually, first of all, we decided to we tried to find some kind of like end game. Like, what
Mm-hmm.
is the thing in the world that would happen? Like, how would the world be if guns were no longer a problem? You know, and it helped us have these multiple perspectives to sort of say it's not only about reducing. Like, if we just took away all the assault rifles, like, would the world then therefore be perfectly better? No, because there's still a lot of handguns. There's still a lot of if we just removed all guns, would that be better? Like, would that necessarily, like, what other side effects would happen? Would that increase other things? And so we settled on reducing gun violence,
Mm-hmm.
and without infringing on sort of personal freedom as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be violence, it could be self-inflicted suicide, it could be homicide, it could be accidental, it could be from the police, it could be from civilians, it could be anything, it could be from the army. So we took this, like, okay, how would you reduce this number from where it is today, and say like 20 years from now, like if this number was half or a third of what it is today, I think we could all agree that the world has gotten better on that spectrum. And we broke up into small groups, and we all tried to come up with a legislative proposal that would have the greatest impact on that number long term. And that was fun. It was we'd already eaten, we'd already like had a couple drinks, we'd already shared a lot of stories, so we had built this trust. And we were just the first thing we did was like realize, oh man, I'm really rusty on my suicide stats and on my like urban violence stats, and so a lot of it was just like realizing how little we knew, and how we also didn't know much about what is the current legislation in California, what is the current legislation, and who is enforcing what. And so part of it was like, okay, we now have to like look up all this information, and we each came back with a proposal that the idea was the other two groups would try to tear it apart as much as possible, in the spirit of like, okay, you can make this wish, and then we're going to be like the evil genie, or I used the monkey's paw story to illustrate like the evil, like you get your wish, but it's going to be twisted so that you regret it. That's a way to like invite criticism without making it feel threatening. And
I thought that was brilliant. So if I can remember you for a second, so Monkey's Paw is one of the best stories. I recommend everybody read it.
It's so good.
And I thought that was a great analogy to bring up that you have somebody playing devil's advocate, but again, it's not a personal thing. It's just, this is our role, and we're just going to kind of play with this idea a little bit. And I think that's a great thing to say, instead of, hey, we're going to take your idea and break it down and see what you think about that. So I thought that was a great way to make it very non-threatening to people. Yeah.
It allowed like the creativity of the devil's advocate side to be enjoyable. You don't feel like you're just tearing them apart and hurting their feelings.
Right.
And everyone got to do it, so it's also a shared thing. So that was good, and it was fun. And we all realized that all of the proposals were bad, which is fine.
But I like the honesty too. Yeah. I really like the honesty. But everybody learned something.
Yeah, we all learned that we didn't know first of all, we learned that we don't know as much as we think we do. It's more complicated than we thought it was. Like there's a lot we could do, but it's not clear. So like we can't go around thinking that we have the answer in our back pocket, and people are just not smart for not doing that thing. So it gave some level of I guess appreciation for the complexity of the problem, which oftentimes is a great outcome. When I talk about it, sometimes people are like, well, that will just create more like anxiety and frustration for me. But it also does the reverse. It also helps you just relax a little bit, because if the solution isn't obvious, then it means that we're gonna have to be patient and start working towards it, and probably have to work together towards it and try to learn along the way. So I find it to be a good outcome. It's also like this traditional Socrates outcome of like aporia was like just make the problem and the question more difficult to understand, and that's success. It's not, you don't need to change people's minds. You just need to make them know that they don't know as much as they thought they did.
Right. Which gets into that Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that cognitive bias where people think they're experts on something. So you kind of flip that on its head and made people think, hey, there's all these other nuances and pieces of it, and that we tend to reaffirm what we think is true.
Right.
And here you are sitting and eating dinner with people and hearing their stories, especially people that have had firsthand experiences.
Yeah.
In this non-threatening environment. And you brought all those people together. So I think that would also be a mediator too, is that these people are your friends. So somebody's really not going to act out because there's some social norms there too.
Yeah. Like it's deep wiring, I think, in our heads to sort of consider people we're eating with as friends or family. And there's all kinds of, historical evidence that, that's always been a way to resolve disagreements. It's like bring them to the table, include them, break bread with them. And you can start to see them as humans again, rather than as animals out in the dark, and, that's one of the hardest things to accomplish in other spaces where you just see an avatar and a name and some mean words, like you can easily dehumanize them. But around a dinner table, around a campfire, like these other things are like very humanizing.
Right. And do you think it also gets in touch with that primal part of the self that everybody eats? And so it's a common. We may have totally polarized ideas, but we eat together, and that's our shared bond.
Yeah. And I
Okay.
think it's even like, the process of digestion also does things to the conversation. Like it
Hmm.
changes our body chemistry. It sort of satiates us a little bit, makes us less likely to like spark in anger. Like we're less likely to want to fight.
Hmm.
Um, you're not supposed to go fight for 30 minutes after having a meal. So, um, so like I think there's a lot of like even biological reasons why having food in your belly is, a it's going to improve your conversations
Hmm.
um, in ways that we don't understand, but like are ancient
Right.
and like part of us. So it takes
Right.
us out of the head a little bit and helps us like, yeah, just experience the conversation on a different level.
Yeah, and I know in my training we were taught that if someone starts escalating their behavior, you give them food and drink because it's grounding, and
Yeah,
it works every single time,
yeah,
because again there's that shared experience and that primal need for satiation. So it's a pretty neat concept. So I really like the fact that you added that into your book about the importance of adding food to
yeah,
conversations. But you're right. Yeah, when people are full, they tend to just kind of chill out a little bit. They tend to not argue. And also,
right,
there's this reciprocal thing of you offered them a good meal, so then they
right,
kind of there's
right,
that well I need to behave a little bit because got some good
right.
food and drink. So
Totally. And you need to
yeah.
pause to eat, and like there's
Mm-hmm.
all, yeah. I think potlucks are a great metaphor, just because like everybody brings something and everyone sort of
Mm-hmm.
shares, and that even is the same thing you want to do in a conversation, and it's just being enacted in a like a ritualistic way versus
Right.
the act of like a rational or cognitive way.
Right.
And the more times you can sort of repeat this pattern of like sharing and taking, and um, I think it starts to sink in, and we start to, I think it just works.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
very, um,
Well,
and
everybody that go ahead.
oh no, that's it. Yeah,
Well, everybody that went to your dinner walked away friends.
yeah,
Nobody
yeah.
nobody had any outward arguments. It sounds like there was some bantering when you had groups kind of being devil's advocate, monkey's paw, but everybody walked away pretty okay. And
Yeah, absolutely.
and
And we
it's
still talk about it. We're just like, wow, that was so great, and we want to do more of those. And I've done a couple other ones.
oh
I
really? With what
think
topics?
I did one for ghosts, which was really interesting.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think I've
Yeah,
read
I
that.
didn't include
Yeah,
that as much in the chapter, but
yeah. I want to know
I
that
think,
one.
yeah, that one was good. Yeah,
So was
and
it
so
pro and anti ghost kind of like?
mhm, mhm.
Okay.
It's like, are ghosts real
Uh huh.
or not? Are they? And then it went to a lot of other things too, because I think that was just more about like the supernatural and
Hmm.
spiritual and versus scientific and rational. And yeah, that was fascinating in a completely different way. Um, yeah.
And what was the? You said there was one more too that you did for the dinner.
Yeah, I've done a couple. I mean, I think there's been one around immigration, and
Hmm.
I think that there's that one I would say was the least structured,
Hmm.
but it came early on, so it was like a proto test of this kind of thing. But yeah, I think there's there's kinds of salons now, like a lot of groups, like living room conversations. There's family
Hmm.
dinners. There's all these organizations that are actually bringing together disagreement and food and salon like behavior. So I'm
Right.
I'm encouraged by all that.
And if you could explain the concept of the salon, because that's something that was around maybe 50, 100 years ago, but it's really not something that's happened now, but you're kind of bringing that back. Could you explain that concept of the salon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on where you live and sort of your neighborhood. I think because I think if you live in New York, it's going to be hard to like invite a bunch of people to your house, if it's too small, um, and or if they're too dispersed, it's really hard to. So I think it's not going to be perfectly easy for everyone, but you could do this in a restaurant too. But the idea is to bring people together for some purpose other than just hanging out, right? Like if you go out to dinner and it's for a birthday, like you spend a little bit of time on the birthday and then you spend most of the time just catching up and talking. But this is about adding one more layer of like, and we're going to talk about this topic, and we're going to do that in a couple different ways. And um, it, it it takes something that has like all this potential and just uses it for that potential. And a lot of times we are in these social circumstances where we don't use all the potential because it takes an organizer and it takes sort of planning. But yeah, I think there should be. It might just be my familiarity effect that's kicking in, but like I feel like there's more of these happening um, now that we like sort of they come into play when everyone's feeling anxious and unhappy about something. So I think we come together in small groups, and salons are a perfect tool. It's like food and usually just some kind of social atmosphere, friendships and networks, and then a topic. And yeah, I mean, I was really impressed or inspired by like Benjamin Franklin, who had this idea of the Huta way back when, where he brought together these people to meet regularly. So sometimes they could be like a repeating kind of thing. And from that came like the public library and the volunteer fire department and all these other things that like, it can be really productive. And, early on in our country, a lot of this stuff was very much practiced. Like it was always about like the small town hall, or the little group that's organizing something.
And the synergistic effect.
Right.
Like with Franklin.
And what can come out of that, and then go do something. Now we just organize across like, employment and family and sometimes religion or other things. But the more loosely held kind of interest groups are mostly online now, which is okay. You can have a lot more of them, but it lacks some of that element as well.
That face-to-face contact piece.
Right,
yeah.
And the food.
Yeah, right. And I was wondering too, you said that in the book that the people that you kind of don't want to start engaging with are people that are maybe real kind of, I'm trying to think of the right word for it. Like fringe kind of, I'm trying to think of a really nice way of saying this. That when you engage in arguments or discussions with people that are so far on one end of the spectrum that it just results in frustration for both people. Is that right? I'm trying to think of what there's a nut analogy. There's a nut analogy in there somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I really liked it. It was that if you engage people that are so far on the end of the spectrum, you just reinforce those belief systems.
Right. Especially if you try to. So I think as people get further away from us, like ideologically, we are less likely to humanize them, and also more threatened by them. Right. Just like a natural instinct. And so the temptation is always to like find the worst person, right? That you can possibly, like the most poorly articulated person, the most easy to shoot down person, and use them as the representative of your opponent's sort of position. And I call that nut picking. It's like you're taking somebody that's like, not and I didn't come up with the word, but I really liked it. And but it's not done in a spirit of actually trying to learn or connect.
Right.
Really just trying to outcast them, ostracize them more.
Right.
So if you really wanted to understand their perspective, you should try to find the person of that group that is the most well-respected, the most sort of articulate, the most able to communicate across, other tribes, and use them to talk to, and like use them as a person that can help you understand their position, and as a person that's most likely to be able to understand your position. And some people call that steel manning, some people call that principled charity, but like try to find these people that are out there that are the most worthy opponent, right? And not the easiest to pick off.
Right. So when someone is putting together Salon, what would you recommend? What are some tips that you have for someone that's like, I really want to get into this thing of having discourse about a topic rather than just sitting and hanging out? What would you recommend for some basic guidelines?
Yeah, there's a couple great guidelines out there. I think On Being has one around. I think she calls them civil conversations or something. Living Room Conversations is another organization that has like basically a handbook. It's like here's 35 handbooks about every single topic. Just take one of these. Here's how you run it. But the basic gist of it is try to get outside your group. Like try to find a mix of people that you are like, and then people that you're not like, and people that are from your work and from your social groups, and friends of friends, and add some variety and diversity to that, of opinion as well as like just anything else, and I would say keep it short. Like just, I would say the first time you do it, you know, have low expectations and just be like, it's mostly about food, but a little bit about this. And the next time you could be like, okay, it's a little bit more about this and a little bit less about food, or it's a balance. Just to be like, it's good to have a fallback. Like if it all unravels, you're like, okay, at least you had a good dessert, and so I would recommend that kind of stuff. Like just take baby steps. Find people that are naturally good organizers, that have like, are always entertaining people to like host this, because they're always looking for a reason to host people anyway. So that's good. But as far as like choosing the topic, I found that it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. I sort of alluded to it with the ghosts. Like ghosts, I try to use the same template that I use with guns, like trying to break up into groups. And it didn't work because it turns out that I think so. Guns is a conflict of hand. Like it's more of a like, what should we do and how can we tie this to policy? Ghosts is really, it's a heart. So it's really about like what is important, and the goal isn't to come up with a strategy, and the goal isn't to like come up with evidence. It really is about sharing stories. So in that kind of situation, just that first half of like sharing stories was plenty to really start to see, and it led to a lot of sort of shifting of my own perspective as well. So I think even that is really interesting. You don't have to have the agenda of, in fact, I would recommend not having an agenda to like change anyone's mind or produce anything necessarily other than enjoyment. And, other things will happen, but that's the primary one.
And I thought it was really neat too that I didn't know what side you were on with things. Which is a really great way to present it. And now I want to know like where you are in certain things. We can talk about that later. But I thought that was a really good way to present it, because it makes it so open to everybody, regardless of what your perception is or your belief system, is that you're not picking a side, and in the book anyway. so I think that neutrality I think is so important.
Yeah, I try a little bit of that, and I also am okay saying what I believe, because I think it's really hard to be unbiased about that stuff. So you might as well admit it, and then try to step back as far as you can from it. But
so the transparency.
Yeah. And I always my natural personality is like the observer too. So I like that kind of, and I'm just generally interested in the stories aspect of people, and that helps. Not everyone has that, but it is a useful trait to have and to practice, I guess, if it sounds interesting.
And it sounds like too, when you have a salon, you want to have a mixture of introverts and extroverts, so people that inwardly observe and then people that speak out more. Would you agree that that's
absolutely? Okay. Yeah, and then someone that can help tease out the introverts a little bit. I mean, I think the round table kind of style of like everyone goes around and tells their story is really good. Small groups are good so that people can sort of speak up in smaller contexts, and those kinds of things. So, like things to like, and you can even go so far as to say like, okay, well, before people, if someone is dominating, you could like come up with like, before you talk, like raise your hand, and we'll make sure that everyone has had a chance to speak before the same person talks over and over again. Because that will also happen.
And I really appreciate that you have ideas for when people are introverts or observers. Because sometimes extroverts, we tend to praise extroverts in society and not so much introverts. So I really like the fact that you're helping them be equal participant. So I thank you so much for doing that.
They've been thinking about their ideas for so long, it's worth sharing them. So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, in summary, what's something that you would like to have someone walk away from after reading your book? So, what's like a kernel of information or kind of a takeaway?
Yeah, I end the book with a couple guidelines for having productive disagreements. I think the thing that I am hoping for is that we start practicing. I think we have to practice having productive disagreements so that even on a small level, like find the perfect like level of difficulty and skill level that you feel, and just like have a conversation about anything with the mindset of making it productive. It could be about it, something about it, it could be about ghosts, it could be about sports, it could be about a TV show, and then work your way up as you feel more confidence around it. And because as soon as we can imagine and even like sort of internalize that feeling of like, okay, it's possible to do this, we can start expecting it from other people. And I think one of the things missing in our sort of political conversation is an expectation that they are productive. We don't expect politicians even approach conversations productively. We just see them as like who can zing the other person the most, because we don't have that because we don't have that expectation. They don't live up to that expectation. If we can start to imagine it and feel it, then I think we can start to expect it of our bosses and our managers and our teachers and our parents and all these other venues where it'll just start to be the expectation, the culture, and we have to sort of work up from there. I think that's the only way that we can improve the quality of the discourse is from the bottom, and so that just means practicing on the individual basis with whatever sort of venue you feel is the one that's both challenging and safe.
That's a great point, that we do need to start from the bottom up in order to expect more from people who represent us too. Yeah. That's an excellent point. Well, thank you so much. It was so nice talking with you.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to chat with you as well. Thank you for all the great questions.
That concludes another episode of Talking Brains. Thanks for joining us, and thank you to Buster Benson for sharing his book, Why Are We Yelling? The Art of Productive Disagreement. And he can be found at busterbenson.com. That's BUSTERBENSON.com. And I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Sarkis, and I can be found at stephaniesarkis.com. And please hit subscribe and give us a rating. It is much appreciated. Thank you.